Welcome to Tomorrow's Cities podcast, a series of conversations on urbanization and disaster risk reduction created by the Tomorrow Cities Hub, a 5-year interdisciplinary research project working internationally to foster a transition from crisis management to multi-hazard risk-informed urban planning in cities of the Global South. My name is Sérgio Spencinha, and I'm the Hub's Communications Officer. In today's episode, we had an insightful discussion with Max Hope from Leeds Beckett University, Michel Wahome from University College London, and Ekin Ekici from Bogaç University in Istanbul. We explored impact perspectives, measurement methods, and the essential conditions for fostering positive change within our cities. Hi Max, hi Michel, and Ekin. Welcome to Tomorrow Cities podcast, and thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to chat with us. In our previous episodes, we discussed issues of inclusive and equity-oriented urban planning, participatory approaches that blend technical and community-driven knowledge, hazard modeling, and even risk communication. Today, our conversation will be at the crossroads of technical work and policymaking. We will be discussing how to transform technical knowledge and scientific data into real-world impact that enables meaningful change in our urban landscapes. But what exactly do we mean when we say that a project or an initiative has had impact? And what conditions are necessary to produce such impact? It might seem obvious, but when we think about it, it isn't so. And that's exactly what we'll be talking today. Max, Michel, Ekin, I have a feeling that each of you has a different understanding of what is impact. So let's start from there. It, these might even sound like an odd question to start with, but I'll do it anyway. Max, what is impact?
Thank you, Sergio. Like you say, I think there are many ways of defining it, and I guess as we discuss it, we'll try and tease some of those out. But for me, perhaps the most fundamental definition for me is that it's really impact is really about the effects that research has beyond academia. So it's out there in the wider world. And I think also, certainly for me, there's an ethical dimension to it. So you're hopefully doing something good and worthwhile in the wider world. You're trying to make a difference. In our instance, with this project, Tomorrow Cities, we're trying to enhance the resilience of cities for the benefit, if you like, of the poorest groups within those cities. So it's those sorts of changes in the wider world beyond the academic research project itself. And maybe just to drill down into that a little bit, I think it's useful to make a distinction between research outputs, research outcomes, and then impact. So an impact chain. So with our project Tomorrow Cities, outputs would be the decision-making environment, it might be the training course, and so on. Those are outputs, project outputs. But outcomes might be, if we delivered the training course in Nepal, there might now be 15 planners in Kathmandu who now understand how to use the Tomorrow Cities project tool. So that would be an outcome. But impacts are something else. They're out there in the wider world, often in situations of much greater scale, with agents and actors that are outside of the project and over which the project has little control. So those impacts are much more long-term and significant and at scale. So I think that is the challenge of impact work. It's easy to create outputs and it's easy to deliver outcomes, or quite easy. But once you get into the whole world of impacts, these longer-term, worthwhile changes at scale, then that becomes difficult.
Thanks, Max. I think we're getting to an interesting point in Tomorrow Cities where we have outcomes already, but making sure that we're delivering impact is yet another story. And on that note, I'll ask Ekin. Ekin has been working quite a lot in Istanbul, and it is your hometown, I think. And Max was just mentioning that we need to move from the quite obvious outcomes where I don't know, let's say that we deliver a capacity strengthening course, or we create hazard models that are able to clearly show the impact of an earthquake in the built environment, or even in the social environment. How are you seeing this from an Istanbul perspective, from a local perspective, let's say?
Thank you, Sergio and Max. For me, at the city level, I would say the impact is about handing over, like obviously the technology and the accumulated knowledge, but also some perspectives and awareness to the community and some working modalities to the local authorities, hopefully. It's about creating a trace there, even after we are gone, as a project. To me, the changes in perspective was something meaningful to observe, because I started off the project with the work package 1 research, right, hands-on on the field, very closely with the communities. So I had a chance to observe how they, in time, how they developed a sense of disaster awareness and risk awareness, and how they also got to exercise their core right to public participation. I think this was really meaningful to me. Through the TCDSC work in Istanbul, we had the chance to bring more than 100 community members from various educational and income levels together with local authorities, and they had the chance to voice and address their problems and needs to decision makers from a risk-informed perspective that was supported by evidence-based information. And I think this was important because this kind of an environment is the enabling environment, and this kind of democracy is it forms the foundation of the enabling environments to make meaningful changes in both policy sense and also from a disaster perspective.
That's. I think this is a great moment to bring in Michel, who's been very quiet in the background. So let's bring Michel into the conversation. Michel, your research has, well, at least partially, been dedicated to scientific knowledge production, and you have a considerable experience in evaluating the impact of research projects such as Tomorrow Cities. Can you share your view on what is impact, maybe with some examples? I suppose that from an academic perspective, it might be slightly different from what we've been talking about so far.
Right. Thanks, Sergio. So what is impact? I think as Max and Ekin have already demonstrated, the definition of that will differ very much depending on the individual and even sort of what they're affiliated with, their discipline, sort of what organizations they work in. And when working on a project such as Tomorrow Cities, that's funded through development financing, the definition of impact develops very technical terminologies. We're expected to think about stakeholders and benefiting them in some way, ensuring that there's economic outcomes from it that are beneficial, livelihoods, as well as well-being. So these are all terms that you'll likely find in a call, for a project proposal. Well-being, economic development, all of these things are ideas that are encompassed within that idea of impact. And the members of the project, the academics themselves, will have their own ideas of what impact looks like, and so will local stakeholders. And it's then becomes the work of bringing all these ideas together to develop a common framework for what the ideal impact scenario is. And along that idea of impact being sort of a technical area in and of itself is this idea that it represents an outcome that takes place perhaps 10 years from now, right? So at the outcome level that Max mentioned, you're thinking more short term, and impact itself is something through this technical framings is something that takes place in the longer term. But for me personally, as an academic and an individual, impact generally refers to the ability to change a particular situation or scenario for the better, for the people involved within that scenario. And it's very important to ensure that those people can articulate what the ideal impact is for them, right? So even though we are constrained by institutional ideas about what impact might look like and when it might take place, it's important to ensure that the people who you're delivering something to are involved in the development of the definition of what good impact is.
You've made two very interesting remarks there. One is the difference that you see between what an outcome is, and it might be something which is short term or immediate, versus impact, which you consider to be something long term. Now, my question, and again, please feel free to intervene and disagree maybe, how do we measure impact? I suppose that there is a difference between the perspective of a project evaluator and the stakeholders who are participating in the project. So, Michel, if you could please address that, it would be very interesting for us to understand what are these differences in these different perspectives.
Right. This is the question for the ages. When it comes to often the funding body will dictate to you how you might record your impact, right? So within this project, we work with a sort of theory of change methodology. And within that, you are supposed to develop what is known as a log frame, which include indicators as well as how you measure those indicators. And that requires you to be predictive, right? So you have to have an impact in mind and have this pathway, as Max mentioned earlier, that you've set and with goals, interim goals that you meet that tell you that you're heading towards your impact. I would say the tricky thing is, despite all the metrics you might put in place, is that especially when you're dealing with complex problems, grand challenges, so to speak, that there's a lot of variables that are not under your control. And so while you might meet your milestones, it doesn't necessarily mean that what you hope will happen. And often what might actually take place might even be better. So there are these serendipitous outcomes that show up, and you make note of them, and they may not necessarily have been in your plan to begin with. So it's always good to be prepared and set up your metrics. Often this will involve surveying the stakeholders that are involved. If you established your metrics and goals for impact with them, you go to them and say, are we headed in the right direction? So surveying them. Often you will also, generally observe what's taking place in the environment of the intervention that you've developed. But as I say, it's not an exact science. You do have to prepare and then make sure that you're noting the serendipitous things that are also taking place and noting the challenges and obstacles that show up in your enabling or disabling environment, and keeping track of those as well.
I see that you're already ahead on what I had planned for this conversation, which is perfectly normal, of course, by mentioning the enabling environment. So I would say for everyone who's listening to keep that term in mind, because we'll be getting back to it in a few minutes. But before I move to Max, I'd love to hear his comments on this issue of how to measure impact, considering it makes a great part of what you've been doing in Tomorrow Cities at the moment. I was listening to Michel and I had this thought. Don't you risk conditioning your research or your work when you predefine uh, impact metrics, these indicators that you'll be using to then evaluate the impact of a project? How do you ensure that that doesn't happen, Michel?
So that is a issue for me. Someone who has evaluated projects, I do think that having these impact goals and a specific model or idea about how they're going to come about can sort of give you a path dependency, and also mean that you are in a position where you feel like you have to demonstrate that that was the correct path you've undertaken, given all the resources that have been mobilized to send you on that route, right? However, I can understand why funders and other organizations are interested in having you have a map or a plan, because they can't just really be disbursing funds to people unless they have some confidence that those people know where they're going. So, as I say, it's good to have a roadmap, but I think it's also good to be aware that things change and there are lots of variables that are out of your control, and that there should be an understanding in sort of the development project world that this is the case, rather than seeing when things don't quite go to plan, to sort of envision that as failure rather than as a requirement for people to adapt and learning from those adaptations.
Max, how has this been for Tomorrow Cities? How do you see the progress in measuring impact, and have we been flexible enough to adapt along the way? Well, it's clear that Tomorrow Cities has undergone significant transformation since 2019. So I'm curious about your perspective on this evolution.
Yeah, I think that's right, Sergio. And Michel, it's been a dynamic process, and certainly where we've ended up wasn't where we started. And that's not a bad thing at all, as the ideas and the focus of the project have developed along the road. I think the measuring and the evidencing is a key challenge, and I suppose I think of it a little bit like the framework that Michel's really usefully described of indicators and so on. I think that's there, isn't it? And especially when it's linked to particular funders and so on and their goals and what's important to them as organisations. So that's we have to evidence our project's impact against that framework. And I suppose I kind of see it sitting beneath that are perhaps the more specific goals of the project, which we need to evidence, and the impact of the project, which if we do, then I think we'll hit we'll hit all of those other targets and indicators at that different level. So, I think more specifically, the thing that we need to evidence is that we've been trying to work with partners and colleagues and stakeholders to try and change the decision-making environment around disaster risk reduction and so on within municipalities and institutions. It's that sort of culture shift, and shifts in values, shifts in practice, shifts in policy. That is our key goal. And all the work that's been done at city level in Istanbul and the cities in Bangladesh and so on has been to try and nudge those practices and values at the institutional level. And, that's not an easy process at all. But I think if we can help contribute to that sort of transformation, then we'll be hitting and evidencing ourselves against that other level of indicators. So kind of boiling that down a little bit more, even, I think in practice, how that's going to happen a lot of the time, and I think Ekin mentioned it, it's about the uptake of the project, the tools and the approach and the philosophy and the values and knowledge that all comes together in the project. And our hope, I guess, is that partner organisations will take that on and they'll embed some of these tools, whatever's useful, within their ongoing work. And organisational change, if you like, decision-making cultural change will happen through that uptake of tools and approach. That's where we've ended up. Obviously, there's other impacts around learning that might go on within organisations, around capacity building and new networks and things. But I think by the nature of the project, because it is a sort of tool-based project, I think, it's this uptake and taking on of the approach that we're hoping will be this agent, this engine for impact and change.
Well, Max, I think you're taking the conversation in the direction that I wanted it to go, to be honest. This actually brings me to a question for Ekin. You mentioned earlier how perceptions in some communities regarding hazards, risks, and disasters have changed along the way as the city was working with Tomorrow Cities. You also emphasize the importance of including these communities in the decision-making process. How do you see the outcomes and results of the Tomorrow Cities project influencing future decision-making processes in Istanbul? I'm obviously interested in how this might impact the municipality involved in the project rather than Istanbul as a whole, given the city's vast size.
Well, as Max has mentioned, we came down to the tools at the end of the day because, like most other things we mentioned, are not really quantifiable and measurable. So, if we are to talk about measuring our impact, I can say that the policy tools that are produced as an outcomes as outputs of what we have been doing so far could be counted as these impacts. And for instance, in Istanbul, we have a prospect to be a part of the strategic plan production process in the local municipality that we are working with. And also, they are about to actually, they suggested TCDSC to be a baseline methodology to be applied in whole of Istanbul and maybe even more municipalities for DRR. I think this shows us in a way that I think it's not only about decision makers, but of course it comes down to that at the end of the day. But even before that, I think the uptake levels by the community was also important in affecting their decisions. And also because we have been through a local election period recently, I think it gained even more importance how the community has valued these works and the participatory planning activities that we have conducted. And finally, decision makers were also able to see the positive impacts and how such studies and activities and our web app and everything else could be very much useful, especially as we are expecting a huge earthquake in Istanbul. So that's why they are very much supportive and in favor of mainstreaming this methodology. And this kind of outputs, I would say, are the most measurable ones at the end of the process that we are at.
Absolutely. Ekin, these are great points and impacts to consider. Well, if the municipality and even the broader Istanbul region are willing or at least interested in adopting our framework, which, by the way, is called the Tomorrow Cities Decision Support Environment, it would definitely be a significant achievement. I might not be an expert in measuring impact, but I have a feeling that by any metric, this seems like a notable success. Ekin, you've touched on various issues related to this, and these differing perspectives on impact are crucial, I believe. But regardless of on how we measure impact, one key aspect remains important, and I think Michel mentioned it before, and you as well, and that's the enabling environment. Max, could you elaborate on what the enabling environment is? Understanding this concept is essential for assessing how we can support and sustain the positive changes that we've been discussing.
Maybe it's not an urban metaphor. I'm thinking of a farmyard. It's a field. It's we have this project with these outputs, which are like the seeds, and we have a field where the project's going to land, and we're trying to, I guess, actively be involved in the cultivation of an environment into which the seeds fall, the tools fall. So if they fall into an enabling environment, it's going to be, just to push the metaphor a bit more, a fertile field. Things are going to grow, things are going to change, there's going to be a transformation. So the wider social and institutional and political and economic environment is absolutely crucial into which the project falls. And, we were right at the beginning, we were talking about how impact can be long-term and involve many actors far outside of the project and things that we have little control over. And that's the enabling environment. It's the environment into which the project falls and the extent to which the environment is going to be able to take the project on, nurture it, grow it, take it in new directions, use it fruitfully. So I think that's how I would think about the enabling environment, but it's certainly that wider institutional, socio-structural environment within which the project is taken on, hopefully, and those impacts that we hope will happen. How's that for a starting definition?
I think that's a great definition, and I love the metaphor. It's simple and it makes it easy for everyone to understand what we're talking about. Well, just like a fertile field. Michelle, do you want to come in and share your perspective on what Max just mentioned?
Well, I like Max's metaphor as well. Fertile ground, sowing seeds, hoping they land in the right place. It's almost biblical, Max, I have to say. It's a very biblical metaphor. But yes, it is the widest space that an intervention lands in hopes that all the plans you've made for it and all the preparation that you've developed means that it will be taken up and used in the way that you expect and hope. And in the project, the Tomorrow Cities projects, one of the things that I have noticed is the extent to which electoral cycles have impacted how things go. And I guess to some extent, you expect that to be the case. But given the fact that the project is, about urban planning, electoral cycles gain this level of importance that you might not see in another project. So whether it's electing a new mayor or a national government, your goals for policy change, but especially since that's one of the goals for the hub, will shift depending on which new players have shown up in government now that the electoral cycle has taken place. So that's one thing that I've noticed. And then another factor that we were not anticipating is acts of God. Fits with the biblical metaphor. However, within the life of the hub, we saw several natural disasters that had fatalities associated with them, both in Quito and in Turkey. And those then become moments in which the hub has to, I don't want to use the word opportunity, but they become points of leverage at where the hub can initiate particular projects or trajectories for the tool that we've developed. So these cycles, both socio-political and also these natural events that can't be predicted, had immense impact on the hub itself and how it was able to redirect itself to either take advantage of particular moments in time or to have to rethink its approach given the changes that have taken place.
And on that note, I think it's the perfect time to bring Ekin into the discussion and to ask you if you can share with us your thoughts on our natural hazard events, such as the earthquake that affected Turkey and Syria last year, has impacted the region. I'm thinking, how has this event influenced the conditions and the perspectives of communities and individuals regarding natural hazards and the risks they face? Has the experience, well, the unfortunate experience, brought about any significant changes to the overall enabling environment in the region?
I see it the other way around, actually, because I think it was a very bitter experience of how our policy environment is not really enabling. And because we have a lot of policies in place, and if you look at the legislation, everything seems pretty elaborate, if not perfect. But what we have been through after these huge earthquakes last year is to see that the implementation is not there, basically. So it's not really enough to have some policy tools, but there are other aspects to it, and these were missing in the case of Turkey, because for the exhibition we had revised the whole disaster risk reduction legislation, and we have seen some patterns that after each very big disaster, there were new legislations, new policies put into effect and everything. But if you look at it, you see that nothing really changes so drastically. Even if they change on paper, there are very limited monitoring, and somehow these nice policies are not implemented. So this, in this case, would be an example of a disabling environment where things are seemingly very good on paper, but not so much in real life. So I think this wasn't exactly the answer to your question, but
No, I think it was. I was seeing it from a different perspective, and you're providing the real perspective based on your actual experience. Michel, please.
Ekin, I had the question, post-earthquake, did you feel, I remember, and this pertains to my answer before, that the exhibition was going to close. And then after the earthquake, there was a sort of revival of interest. And so I was thinking that that was related to the outcome of the earthquake, and wondering whether this renewed interest in the exhibition of what the hub had generated then translated into more people requesting information, asking for your assistance in thinking through policy in any way. But yes, I take your points, and I understand your position completely.
Thank you, Michel. Yes, definitely the exhibition took a completely different turn after the earthquakes, because it was right about time we were planning, we were in the planning process for the exhibition, and we were having some challenges in finding a proper venue for it. But after the earthquakes, it suddenly became very much valuable and popular, and we actually were granted with a very nice popular public place, pro bono even. So I think this is just a simple example how people's focus directly shifts very suddenly. And yes, of course, all the institutional perspective has turned to sorry, I will say this again. The whole institutional perspective has suddenly focused on the earthquake once again. Although this is the reality of Turkey, we have a lot of fault lines. We are in a very earthquake-prone area, and this should never be forgotten. But unfortunately, it is from time to time. But after the earthquake, everyone was suddenly much more interested in everything related to DRR. And the municipalities have really paced up the urban transformation processes, which is, personally, I think it's controversial if it's for the good or bad at this point, but this is another subject.
Yes, I think, just to add really to the emerging theme, I suppose, of a disabling environment as well as an enabling one. I think it's important to remember that the aims of the project, namely this pro-poor, risk-informed DRR, it's not a neutral set of technical goals. It's a political program. It's about equality. It's about democracy. It's about poverty reduction. That is our starting point as a political position. And then thinking about impact and whether it's going to be taken on by other organisations, it's only going to be taken on by other organisations that are also pro-poor, care about human rights and the universal values and so on. And that's fundamental to the whole idea of uptake and impact in some longer term sense. So then you flip it round and you think about the disabling environment, and you just think about, okay, well, what sort of political context and situations does that stuff not happen in? So rather than a more democratically orientated political environment or a more progressive one, you might have anti-democratic forces, and you might have authoritarian forces, and you might have agencies and organizations that are more about looking after the needs of a particular political group rather than the wider population. And it would be those sorts of features that would be perhaps typical of a disabling environment, which would undermine and hinder and perhaps block the uptake of DRR informed planning in some sort of ongoing sense. So I guess it does take us back to those really challenging structural and institutional features, many, if not all of them, which are far beyond the control of the project.
I was going to comment on that. It feels like overall, and this is a personal view based on what Max just mentioned, that this is indeed a political issue. You might want to disagree or even comment, but it seems to me that the environment in which projects like Tomorrow Cities operate is often disabling, given the current economic models in our societies. It doesn't seem to me that we are in an enabling environment overall. The actual context appears more unfavorable, which makes it feel like we're constantly pushing boundaries that break cycles of risk creation and inequality. Do you want to comment on that?
I can come in there, Sergio. I mean, I think you're right. I think it's not an easy thing to do at all. But I think it seems to me, looking back, one of the things that's come through is that in all of the city contexts, we have actually found, what would you call it, a point of contact, an entry point into the particular political social context in Istanbul, Nablus, the cities in Nepal, and so on. We've found in each of those cities, through our partners, through city partners and stakeholders, a point where the project can perhaps have some influence and push, and where things might be taken up, the tool and the approach and so on. And I think I can think of it as a middle level entry point. We haven't been dealing directly very much with national governments, although we have a little bit. Yes, we have had local participation, and that's important, but it seems to be that those middle level structures, like municipalities, like the provincial governments in Nepal, like the administration in Palestine and in Nablus in particular. So it's that level that we've connected, if you like, with political structures and the wider enabling environment. And I think we've found, maybe, I don't want to be too optimistic, that there is possibilities for movement there. So the municipalities that Ekin is working with, and I shouldn't be speaking for the Istanbul case, but I'm going to anyway, seem to be progressive and dynamic and wanting to take things on. In Nepal, it's the provincial government there that's a new political structure between the national and the local. They're really keen to get involved, and I suppose it's part of them establishing their reputation and legitimacy, and so on and so on. So each of our city cases, in different ways, I think there are these entry points. So it's not like we've had massive changes, but we have made connections and things which might form the basis of future movement and pathways and so on, and the tools and values of the project going on in some form in each of the cities. So whilst not overall change, points of movement, lines of change might be a better way of thinking about it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So we're creating ripples, right, in the overall political and policy context. Ekin or Michel, does this mean that it's possible to influence or even create an enabling environment? But going back to Max's metaphor, if we have a barren soil, can we fertilize it in some way to make it productive? How can we nurture this environment to support growth and positive change?
Yeah, I think definitely yes. Working in Global South has, as you described, it has actually two sides of it. It is maybe not everything is perfectly so much in place institutional wise, but it also gives you a certain flexibility and something to work with, something you can shape and structure in favor of disaster risk reduction and other public gains. So that's why I think it's also important that we could find some right partners and stakeholders in the field. And yeah, I think it is something transformable. It's not something static, of course. Neither the policy environment nor the community. In some countries, there might be some, as I said before, some political tools or the implementation capacity or some other factors might be missing, or they might be a disadvantage for positive policy changes. But I think as the Tomorrow Cities project, we have an overall positive experience in the local sense, at least. Because as Max has said, we haven't been dealing with national governments so much. But in a more local sense, I also believe that we have led to some positive changes.
I will highlight something that's coming up in the discussion, which I think is this overall tension between being funded to change a status quo, especially on behalf of marginalized people, and to do it in a way that is impactful, right? So already you are operating from a position of I guess the underdog. So you are expected to have this influence on behalf of people who generally don't have influence within their own environment. So there's this underlying tension there. And for me, what this evokes for me is this map I spoke about earlier, that having to develop this roadmap for change while still being aware of the challenges that you'll be faced with. And I feel like funders or organizations should think more about this idea of relationships that Max identifies, that instead of the questions about how will you deliver this particular impact, maybe it's more questions around process, like who do you know, how will you develop relationships with them, because relationships are ultimately how any of this gets done. And so thinking about that more carefully rather than trying to predict a particular outcome, I think would be most useful.
And maybe just to jump in a little, I was thinking, Sergio, of your point about how do you create or fertilize the field, or whatever the metaphor is. I mean, I was thinking, Tomorrow Cities is exactly what Tomorrow Cities is trying to do. The funder, a lot of money has been spent precisely to do that work, to try and create change and create an enabling environment, and create tools in which things can be moved in a progressive way in the direction that the values of the project reflect. So I think we can think about Tomorrow Cities as being an enabling environment itself, or perhaps it's better to think of the Tomorrow Cities in partnership with local city teams and other stakeholders as an enabling environment. Maybe we're the fertilizer, or maybe we're an enabling environment, but I think that's quite a positive way of thinking about what the project is. And I suppose that does raise the question of what happens next as we move out of the directly funded phase. Is the network going to fade away, or is there going to be a transfer of responsibilities within the network, and on it goes, and in some new form, some new enabling environment that takes the project onwards? I think that's the sort of crucial moment that we probably are in at the present time.
I think and we're approaching the end of our time. I believe that we are ending on a positive note. We've identified the challenge, but we also provided some clues on how to trigger positive change in our cities. You all mentioned the importance of working with the right partners and organizations to create a positive movement. It might sometimes seem small and insignificant, but I think these efforts can stir up movement and create ripples that grow over time. Leaving a positive legacy is crucial, and I think, well, at least it seems like this approach can help us achieve that. If anyone has any further remarks, please feel free to share.
Just in the context of what you just said, Sergio, mentioned the idea of the Tomorrow Cities community of practice, so that beyond direct funding, there's still going to be some entity called Tomorrow Cities, which will be a looser thing and not funded in the same way, if at all. but it'll still be there, and it will be an ongoing community of practice, which stakeholders and partners and all those involved in the project thus far and new partners can be in some sort of relationship, and that'll be a thing that will go on. And okay, within the cities, you could imagine, for example, in the Nepali cities, that the provincial government will be the key agent and actor in the new enabling environment in Nepal. But this sort of looser community of practice might be in there too, and be part of these ongoing plans and policies and perhaps future projects and things. So I think that's quite a positive image of the Tomorrow Cities thing not falling away. But okay, it's going to be in a more ghostly form or something, not as a substantial a form, but it'll still be there, and it'll have an important role to try and enable, and we'll be part of funding bids and all those sorts of things. So perhaps we can imagine the enabling environment, this network, continuing in some form.
Yeah, Max, absolutely. I think we're not just building a project and then moving on, right? We're working for the future and remaining engaged with the cities that we worked with, trying to forge lasting partnerships that can last for a long time. Michel, Ekin, any additional thoughts to add to these final remarks?
Yeah, I would like to sort of piggyback on what Max was saying there, that if we are going to think about one of the hub's Tomorrow City's greatest impacts, it will be these collaborations that have been established and that will go forward into the future. These relationships that may have been sort of predicted in the theory of change, because we did mention a global network, but I think the value of that network is yet to be seen. It's been really interesting and gratifying to see how, as new cities have been introduced into the hub, that they've gone on to join and also bring to bear their own knowledge in other cities, and that's been really great to see. Istanbul has been quite a linchpin, I think, within the hub, being able to share a lot of its the knowledge that it's generating with other cities. So that cross-city collaboration has been really valuable, I think, and it's great to hear that it will go forward in this ghostly form, as Max says. And in the future, maybe 50 to 100 years from now, maybe there'll be actual cities, because Tomorrow Cities is very future oriented. There'll be actual cities that have been built using the tool, and that would be quite an impact if it were to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I wish that we'd still be around to see that, but maybe not. In any case, it's always good to to feel that we're contributing to something that's long lasting, even if we can't see the end of it. Just like seeds, sometimes take time to sprout.
I think even if it will take a long time to see like very radical changes in these cities, we have already inspired some really nice, positive changes in many respects, institutional, social, or administrative, or scientific, whatever. So I think it's every context has their own peculiarities, but I believe that there is already some uptake in each city, and I also believe that we will always be around as ghost farmers, as Max said.
Yeah, well, I agree. We closed the loop, right? We started by trying to define what impact is, and we're somehow closing the loop with what you just said, Ekin, that leaving these positive changes, even if small, they will surely produce ripples for the future. And well, in my perspective, that's impact, right? It has to be impact.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's it. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Max, Ekin, Michel. It was a great pleasure to talk to you. I'm sure that we'll meet again in the near future. Probably one of the many meetings that we have in Tomorrow Cities. And for everyone who's listening, well, thank you for tuning in. And don't forget that we have 3 other episodes on Spotify. Follow us on Twitter, on Spotify. We're also on LinkedIn. And check our website at tomorrowcities.org. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye. For more information on the project, visit tomorrowcities.org and follow us on X, LinkedIn, and YouTube.